Welcome to the debate. Imagine you are a being of pure, boundless energy. You exist entirely outside of time. And then, suddenly, you are handed a ticking clock.
Right, a completely alien concept to you.
Exactly. You have never experienced an end, you have never known decay, and you've never felt the rigid, uncompromising boundaries of a physical object.
Because you are infinite.
Yes, you're infinite. So to truly understand this ticking clock, to comprehend the concept of a mechanism that eventually, inevitably stops, you can't just observe it from afar. You have to climb inside the gears.
You have to actually become the clock, in a way.
You do. You have to forget your boundless nature, bind yourself to the mainspring, and experience the tension of the unwinding mechanism firsthand.
And that deeply immersive, honestly somewhat terrifying scenario is exactly the conceptual landscape we are navigating today. We are examining a philosophical framework that details the specific mechanics of an eternal, dynamic spirit plunging into the static, finite material universe.
It's a fascinating model.
It really is. It is a system where the spirit is driven by this intrinsic need to comprehend the whole of reality. It looks out and sees the stark reality of death, limitation, exploding planets, collapsing stars, and it realizes, it needs to understand finitude.
Right, it needs the data.
Exactly. So it immerses itself in a physical body to gather that experiential data. But the catch is, upon entering the material plane, it undergoes a total loss of memory. It has to forget its divine origin so it can authentically experience the hard limitations of matter.
Which brings us to the core disagreement we are going to explore. When this eternal spirit enters the material world to gather raw data about mortality, it brings along its inherent, inextinguishable moral nature.
The heavy baggage.
Well, I wouldn't call it baggage. It brings its drive for love, for brotherhood, for cooperation. I will be arguing that this unshakable divine ethics and the resulting tension it creates with the material world is the exact mechanism of meaningful dynamic evolution.
And I will be taking the opposing view. I argue that this inherent divine nature is in fact a profound systemic hindrance.
A hindrance?
Absolutely. When we look closely at the mechanics of this model, the spirit's inability to shed its own morality actively sabotages the raw, unfiltered material experience it was sent here to gather. It dilutes the very experiment it initiated.
Let's lay out our positions a bit more clearly then. My perspective is that the spirit's journey is about actualizing what the framework calls its potential infinity.
Right.
The goal is to create a dynamic unity within the divine principle. The fact that the spirit has an unbreakable connection to divine ethics, things like charity and empathy, sure, it prevents it from living a purely material, anti-spiritual life.
It totally stops it.
But that is not a sabotage of the data. That is the vital tension that defines spiritual evolution. By maintaining these high ethical principles while utterly submerged in dense matter, the spirit transcends mere data collection.
I just don't see how.
Because it doesn't just record facts. It achieves a true integrated comprehension of existence. It learns how to be infinite within the finite.
Well, the problem I see is that the philosophical architecture we are looking at explicitly labels the spirit as the principal impediment to its own earthly evolution. I mean, think about the parameters of the experiment.
Okay.
The spirit theoretically needs to understand the harsh, finite rules of matter. To do that accurately, it needs a purely material, perhaps even anarchic or anti-spiritual life. It needs to know what it is to be a physical object acting upon other physical objects.
But it's not just an object.
Right. But because it cannot switch off its inherent divine essence, it forces itself into a compromised half-and-half existence. It is perpetually caught between two worlds, trapping itself in a slow, heavily mediated cycle of mediocre human experiences.
Let's break down exactly how this immersion works, because understanding the mechanics is crucial here. The spirit exists in a state of eternal intelligence. It looks across the threshold of its own existence and observes the material universe.
The exploding planets and such.
Exactly. It sees planets exploding, it sees biological life decaying and ending, and it is struck by a profound ontological question. Could my life end too?
Which is a wild concept for an eternal being.
Exactly. To answer that, to achieve total self-knowledge by deeply understanding its complete opposite, it must penetrate those material structures. It has to induce amnesia because if it remembers it is eternal, the threat of death isn't real.
It wouldn't learn anything. It needs skin in the game.
Precisely.
But here is the paradox at the heart of the system. To perfectly learn about the material world, the human vehicle must be completely given over to the material experience. It requires a life defined by the raw, static, finite laws of matter.
I agree with that premise.
Yet the framework dictates that the spirit simply cannot stop itself from manifesting love, charity, and cooperation. I come at it from a different way. This inability to switch off its divine nature effectively mutilates its capacity to fully grasp the material universe.
Mutilates is a strong word.
But it's accurate. If you were sent to study the ruthless reality of a purely physical system, a system governed by consumption and decay, but you refuse to stop applying eternal divine ethics to it, you are contaminating your own petri dish.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are treating the material experience as if it requires the spirit to become completely indistinguishable from matter.
Well, doesn't it? Not at all. Let me give you a different perspective. Think of the spirit as a deep-sea diver tasked with exploring the crushing, lightless depths of the ocean.
Okay, I like this analogy.
The ocean represents materiality. It is static, dense, and profoundly hostile to the diver's natural environment above the surface.
Right, the divers shouldn't be down there.
Exactly. Now, the diver's heavy, pressurized suit represents those inherent divine ethics, the structural integrity of the spirit. Does the suit limit the diver's freedom of movement? Yes. Does it prevent a pure, unfiltered exposure to the freezing water? Absolutely.
So you admit it limits the experience. It limits the exposure, not the experience. Because without that suit, the diver doesn't experience the ocean. The diver is simply crushed by it. The diver ceases to be an observer and just becomes debris.
That is a vivid image, I'll give you that. But let's look at the actual implications of wearing that suit. What is the actual quality of the data being collected while locked inside it?
I'd argue it's high quality.
The logical approach to this experiment, if the goal is truly to understand matter, would be for the spirit to live an anti-ethical, anti-spiritual, highly conventional life. It needs to know matter, so it should act like matter.
But it can't.
Exactly. It refuses to. Because it continually transfers its ethical principles to the consciousness of the body, it refuses to engage in the very behaviors that would yield the most intense material data. It pulls its punches.
But those restraints are the necessary parameters for observation. The general principle of the universe tends toward the preservation and integrity of the spirit's personal structure.
But at what cost to the data?
You call it a contamination of the Petri dish, but if the diver takes off a suit to get better data on the water pressure, the experiment ends instantly.
Right, but because the diver is wearing such a restrictive suit, the data collection is agonizingly slow. I mean, the spirit must incarnate vastly more times than it would technically need to.
That assumes time is a factor.
It is. It is dragging its feet through the material world, weighed down by its own divine conscience. It creates a state of perpetual friction, where the human vehicle is never fully spiritual because it is submerged in matter, and never fully material because it is haunted by the spirit.
Haunted is an interesting choice of words.
Well, it is a self-imposed purgatory of half measures.
Except time is entirely relative here. The model explicitly notes that since the spirit originates in and ultimately resides in a dimension of non-time, this supposed slowdown is fundamentally irrelevant on a universal scale.
Irrelevant?
Yes. Whether it takes one incarnation or 10,000, the eternal timeline remains unchanged. Furthermore, those half measures are what actually produce the synthesis of knowledge.
How so?
If the spirit simply came down, acted with total anarchy, and behaved exactly like a rock smashing into other rocks, it would learn nothing about the contrast between spirit and matter.
But it would understand matter.
The learning doesn't happen in a vacuum, though. It happens at the boundary line. It happens at the exact point of friction between the spirit's instinct to cooperate and the material world's instinct to consume.
Let's follow that friction then, because that internal friction doesn't just stay inside the individual diver's suit.
No, it certainly doesn't.
When you put billions of those deep-sea divers in the same ocean, their individual ethical restraints inevitably build a macro structure, and this brings us to how the framework views human civilization.
Exactly. The collective societal laws we build are not a failure of the mission. They are the macro-level manifestation of the spirit's intrinsic need for cooperation.
I don't know if I'd call it a success.
It is the spirit successfully projecting its divine blueprint onto the material plane. The model references the principle of universal cooperation, the baseline instinct to help, which manifests on the human level as brotherhood.
Yes, it mentions that.
It even nods to the mandate of St. John, the imperative to do no harm to your neighbor. Remember, your neighbor is also a spirit engaged in the exact same process of experiential data gathering.
Right, the whole do unto others concept.
If you act with total anarchy to gather your own intense material experiences, you inevitably violate the bodily and psychological integrity of another spirit, denying them their capacity to gather data.
Okay, but
So, civilization and the rule of law is the great mediator. It is the spirit attempting to navigate the harshness of the material universe without destroying itself or its peers.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are framing civilization as this noble, protective mediator, but the philosophical model we are examining explicitly frames it as a suffocating trap.
A trap?
Yes, humans driven by this underlying spiritual impulse you mentioned have adopted a series of laws that, over time, have rigidified into dogmatic taboos. The framework literally calls this civilization an ulterior remora.
Wait, for those listening who might be unfamiliar with that specific translation, an ulterior remora is essentially a parasite or a drag weight, right? Like a remora fish latching onto a shark and slowing it down?
Exactly. It's a further hindrance attached to an already hindered system. Because of these societal taboos, the spirit finds itself in the tragic position of not being able to move according to its true evolutionary finality.
But that structure allows for survival.
Humans are constantly renouncing their true personalities to maintain a conservative, balanced social order. They play it safe. If the entire point of the incarnation is to deeply understand the extremes of the material universe, how does sitting in a polite, highly regulated conventional society achieve that?
It achieves it through immense internal complexity.
But look at what it looks like in practice. The framework asks a brutal question. Why did a divine principle send us here to live a life that, if we look at it honestly, often appears completely ridiculous?
What ridiculous is subjective.
Imagine a being of pure, boundless energy, capable of comprehending the birth of galaxies, sitting in a beige cubicle for 40 hours a week, quietly panicking about whether they use the right font on a quarterly report, terrified of social ostracization.
That is a very specific, modern image.
But it applies. That is what this model calls a stupidified existence. We spend our days engaging in such mundane, trivial, conventional behaviors that it seems impossible a divine soul is driving the vehicle. That mundane reality is the direct result of the taboos you are defending.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on that person in the cubicle. The life only appears ridiculous or stupidified if you measure it by the wrong metric.
What's the right metric then?
Yes, the daily human experience is often mundane on the surface. But why is that person in the cubicle? They are there because they are participating in a highly complex, interconnected, cooperative social structure that ensures millions of people don't starve.
That feels like a stretch.
The energy required to maintain that order is immense. And the framework provides a brilliant technological metaphor to explain exactly how knowledge is extracted even from a heavily regulated life. It compares the human body to a microphone, and the spirit, residing in the unconscious, to a recording reel.
Ah, the microphone and the reel. This is where the mechanics get really specific.
Right. The microphone is out in the streets. It's the physical senses, the biological reality, picking up the noise, the friction, the physical sensations of existence.
The raw data.
It transmits those signals through the wire of the unconscious down to the recording reel of the spirit. For the reel to capture anything of value, the microphone simply has to be active. The life must be lived.
Sure.
The intensity required for spiritual evolution isn't necessarily about anarchy or raw survival or breaking taboos. It's about deep, conscious engagement with whatever reality the body is in,
But let's trace that exact metaphor through to its logical conclusion, because it actually proves my point.
I don't think it does.
The mechanics dictate that if the microphone doesn't work well or if it is closed off, nothing passes to the recording reel. If the human vehicle is paralyzed by the spiritual mandate to do no harm and terrified of breaking societal taboos, the microphone is muffled.
Not muffled, just focused.
You essentially have a microphone wrapped in layers of foam, locked in a quiet, climate-controlled room, absolutely terrified to go out into the loud, chaotic street.
I wouldn't say it's locked in a room.
It is intentionally avoiding the extremes of the physical world. The reel is spinning, but it's recording elevator music when it needs to be recording thunder.
Elevator music, really?
The model explicitly warns that if the life is scarce in intensity and quality, if it's just a continuous loop of playing it safe, nothing of evolutionary value passes to the spirit.
But that's a misinterpretation of intensity.
The grand tragedy of this entire setup is that the spirit needs the microphone to be out in the howling winds of the material universe. It needs the extremes of finitude, but the spirit's own inherent morality forces the human to stay inside, keep the volume down, and follow the rules.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. You are equating intensity with destruction or lawlessness.
I'm equating it with raw material action.
Right, but the howling winds don't have to be anarchic to be profound. The intense life the model calls for can be lived entirely within the bounds of a moral cooperative existence. The friction of trying to maintain love in a universe defined by decay is intensely difficult.
I mean, sure, it's difficult emotionally.
It produces a massive amount of high-fidelity data for that microphone to pick up.
How so? Give me an example of how playing by the rules generates high-fidelity data about a ruthless material universe.
Think about grief.
Okay.
When a human being experiences the loss of a loved one, when they face the exact finitude and death the spirit came here to study, the profound earth-shattering grief they feel is only possible because of their inherent spiritual capacity for love.
Right, that attachment. If they were purely material, if they were the anarchic, highly logical sociopaths you suggest the experiment requires, they wouldn't feel the tragedy of death.
They would just observe a biological machine stopping, a change in state.
A cold observation.
Exactly. The ethical baggage doesn't muffle the microphone. It is the amplifier. It amplifies the emotional resonance of the material facts. Grief is the thunder. Love, in the face of decay, is the thunder.
That is a beautiful way to look at human emotion. I'll admit that. But we have to stick to the mechanics of the framework. The model literally states that the spirit would be much facilitated if it didn't bring its feelings along.
It says it's a paradox.
It openly calls this a paradox. Yes, it states clearly that the spirit's innate qualities slow its earthly path. You are looking at the emotional resonance of grief, which is valid for a human, but the source material is deeply concerned with the mechanics of knowledge acquisition regarding the static, finite laws of matter.
And it is acquiring that knowledge.
Inefficiently. The spirit is trying to understand an entirely different operating system. It's like trying to understand the precise mechanical engineering of a combustion engine by only reading romantic poetry about fire.
That's quite a metaphor.
Yes, the poetry captures the feeling of the heat, but it doesn't teach you how the pistons work. The spirit's inability to engage with matter purely on matter's terms means it takes countless lifetimes, countless cycles of this stupefied existence to piece together the stark, mechanical realities of the physical universe.
Yet taking countless lifetimes is part of the design. It is a feature, not a bug.
A very tedious feature.
The spirit brings its own eternal law into a universe governed by finite external laws. The material universe is infinite, in fact. It is fully created, a closed circuit of cause and effect.
Right.
The spirit, however, is infinite in potential. It must actualize that potential through evolution. This incredibly slow, methodical, ethically bound process of interacting with matter allows the spirit to metabolize the experience safely.
So it's protecting itself.
If the divine principle simply wanted a raw data dump of physical parameters, there would be no need for the intricate, beautiful dance of incarnation. A computer could do that. The goal is the transformation of the spirit, the hard-won realization that after all the explosions of nebulas and the deaths of biological bodies, only the life of the spirit is eternal.
I agree that the realization of its own eternity is the ultimate goal of the framework. but I cannot look past the incredibly messy, compromised way this system achieves it.
Messy is just another word for complex.
When you strip away the romanticism, the model leaves us with a vision of humanity that is profoundly alienated. We are divine beings trapped in a reality we don't naturally fit into, forced to use a biological microphone to gather data for an unconscious real, all while fighting our own intrinsic nature just to get through a normal Tuesday.
It's certainly a struggle.
We can't be purely spiritual because we are anchored to a decaying body, and we can't be purely material because we have a soul demanding we act with brotherhood. The resulting conservative, middle-of-the-road human experience is a testament to an experiment that is constantly fighting its own parameters.
As we draw this discussion to a close, it is clear we are looking at two sides of a profoundly complex philosophical coin.
Unquestionably.
From my perspective, the tension between the eternal ethical nature of the spirit and the finite static boundaries of the material world is the exact mechanism of dynamic evolution. It is not a design flaw.
Though it certainly acts like one.
It is the exquisite, deliberate friction that allows a boundless consciousness to truly comprehend limitation, thereby generating a dynamic, realized unity within the divine principle itself. The inherent ethics do not ruin the experiment. They give the raw data of the material universe its ultimate meaning.
And from my perspective, the mechanics paint a picture of inherent tragedy and paradox. The spirit is dispatched to comprehend the hard, uncompromising boundaries of physical matter, yet it is fundamentally too divine to fully engage with them.
Right, its inextinguishable ethics and the collective taboos of civilization act as a muffled barrier, severely compromising the human body's ability to act as a clear microphone. The result is a looped cycle of limited, cautious incarnations, where the true extreme nature of the material world is kept at arm's length by the very soul trying to study it.
Yet, despite our differing interpretations of the spirit struggle, we both recognize the profound mechanics laid out for us today. The complete, necessary loss of memory upon incarnation, the heavy reliance on the human body's senses to gather experiential data, and the ultimate quest to conquer the fear of finitude by proving the eternity of the self.
Exactly. We agree on the engine, just not on its efficiency.
Right. There is so much more nuance to explore regarding how the spiritual and material universes mirror and oppose each other within this architecture.
Absolutely. If you're listening to this and wondering why an eternal being would subject itself to the quiet frustrations of daily life just to gather data, you aren't alone. It forces us to look at the mundane moments of human existence, the conventions, the rules, sitting in traffic, not just as sociology, but as the friction of an eternal entity trying to fit into a temporary box.
Exactly. It leaves us returning to that ticking clock we started with. We are infinite beings, bound to the mainspring, feeling the tension of every passing second. The question remains, is the ticking a distraction from our eternal nature, or is it the very rhythm that teaches us what eternity truly means?